Welcome to another episode of Mexican in the Kitchen. For this recipe, I'm going to start very simple. I'm going to use 280 grams of sausages, weenies, whatever you want to call them, and also whatever kind of sausage you want. I'm using turkey because I really like the flavor, but you can use whatever you prefer, and you can also use other kinds of sausages, or you can completely skip them if you want to make these vegetarian or vegan option. How you cut them is completely up to you. What I like to do is split them in half and then cut them into smaller pieces. I have seen people preparing this dish where they don't cut the sausage in half, they don't cut it into small pieces, they cut big chunks, and that's fine if you prefer that, but I like cutting small pieces because then when you take a spoon of this dish, then you get a bit of everything in there. That's why I prefer it this way. Once we have cut our sausages, then we can set them aside and continue with the rest of the ingredients. The main ingredient for this recipe is probably the zucchini or summer squash. These ones look a bit different to the ones I'm used to buying in Mexico, but there's quite many varieties. Just buy whatever you can find where you live, whatever is the freshest, whatever is seasonal, then of course that will always be the best. What I will do with these is just cut the tips off and then I can start chopping the zucchinis. For this recipe, I'm using around 650 grams. How do you cut the zucchini for this recipe is again completely up to you. I have even seen people who just make slices out of it and use that on this dish. Personally, what I prefer to do is cut it in half and then I will start dicing the whole zucchini. However you decide to cut your zucchini, there's one thing you have to keep in mind, and that is try to make all the pieces as even as possible. The reason for this is when we throw them into the pan and we cook them, we are mixing all the ingredients. We want them to be even sized so they will cook at the same time. Once we are done, we can set the zucchinis aside and continue with the rest of the ingredients. I am using one small onion and one garlic clove. I'm just going to chop them and set them aside. Remember, we're cooking this a la Mexicana, so we need garlic, onion, and of course some tomato. Tomatoes I will also dice and set aside. In this case, I'm using 3 tomatoes, medium to large sized. The beauty of this recipe is that you can play with ingredients. You don't have to be too precise. You can add a bit more or a bit less of whichever ingredient you prefer or you don't like so much. And it's very simple. It's very hard to go wrong with this because you can always taste and rectify. Since we are doing this a la Mexicana, of course we cannot miss some chili. For that, we can use some jalapeno if you don't want it too spicy. You can use serrano if you want a bit more of a kick, or any fresh chili you can get where you live. If you don't want this to be too spicy, you can also remove the seeds from these chilies. Personally, I don't mind. I am the only one who will be eating these, and I really like spicy food, so I'm going to leave them there. I'm going to be a bit lazy, but that's one option as well. Now we can set them aside and we are done preparing our ingredients. As usual, I want to remind you, if you are cutting chilies, really wash your hands right after. You don't want to be touching your face and learning why it's important to wash your hands after this the rough way. Once all the ingredients are ready, we can start preparing our dish. For that, I have a pan on the stove. It's on a 7 out of 9, so medium-high fire. I added a splash of oil, and I'm going to throw my weenies or sausages in there. These are pretty much ready to eat. They don't need a lot of cooking. I'm going to throw them in there. I'm just going to keep moving them from time to time. I don't want to burn one side. I want to brown them, and I want to cook them as evenly as possible. After a while, this is how they look, and I'm going to set them aside because they will still cook a bit longer once I add them back. On the same pan, I added a bit of oil again, and I'm going to add my onion and my garlic. If you have seen some other of my videos, you might be familiar already with this process. When I do a la Mexicana, it's usually the same process. I'm going to start on a pan, a bit of oil, garlic and onion, and we're going to cook that for about 5 minutes. It's usually cooked until we call it acitronar. This means the onion and the garlic, you will notice they start turning this kind of see-through color, and that's exactly the point where we can continue adding the rest of our ingredients. The next thing I will add is the jalapeno or the serrano, and right after that I'm adding also the tomatoes. Some people might skip one of the tomatoes and add a bit of tomato puree just to give a bit more flavor, maybe a bit more of a thicker texture, but personally I don't think that's necessary. When you add the tomatoes, you will immediately notice they start releasing some of that liquid, and that will bring some of the liquid to our dish. Of course, we can add a bit more later, but the texture the tomatoes get mixed with all the rest of the ingredients, that's the base for these a la Mexicana kind of recipes, and that's something I really like. Now we just need to wait for a bit. We want to cook this for a while before we add the rest of the ingredients. I'm going to keep an eye on it, keep moving it from time to time, just make sure nothing gets stuck, nothing starts burning. And after that, we can continue adding the rest of the ingredients. After a while, the texture has changed. Tomatoes have given a lot of color to the dish, and now I'm going to add the zucchini. At this point, I realized maybe the pan was a bit too small, and I could have used a pot. If you think this is the case, maybe use a bit of a larger pot when you do this, but I made it work. This is a 28 centimeters diameter pan, and it was okayish, but of course you can make your life easier with a larger one. Here I will also add some corn. This is about 150 to 100 grams. You can add more or less depending on what you prefer. If I was in Mexico, I would add the white corn, the one that's not sweet. But here in Finland, this is the one I can get, and it also works quite nicely with this dish, so use whichever you prefer. This dish is very simple. I'm just going to add some salt, some pepper, and that's pretty much all the seasoning I'm going to use. After adding salt and pepper, I like to add a bit of broth into the mix. On the side, I prepared some chicken broth. If you are trying to do this into a vegan or vegetarian option, skipping the sausages or the weenies, maybe you can add some vegetable broth. Personally, I only added half a cup. You can add up to 1 cup if you want, but I just added a bit because we still have some of the liquid from the zucchinis coming. I just want this to be moist enough to have enough water or liquid so that it won't dry up when I'm cooking it. At this point, I'm going to mix everything. I'm going to let this cook for about 5 minutes. 5 minutes later, I'm going to add my weenies or my sausages, and I'm going to again mix everything, make sure all the ingredients mix nicely. Once we have mixed everything, I'm going to put the lid on, and I'm going to let this cook for between 5 and 10 minutes. I recommend you check on this after 5 minutes. Try one of the zucchinis because that's the vegetable that we are worried about. We want it to be a bit crunchy, but nicely cooked. Of course, the texture is completely up to you. You can cook it a bit longer and make it a bit more soft. Once the zucchinis have the texture you like, then this is ready for serving. For serving, you have quite many options. You can serve it on rice, you can serve it by itself, maybe make tacos or sandwiches out of it. It's one of those dishes you can do many things with. When serving, I like to top this with a bit of sour cream. This is how I make these zucchinis a la Mexicana. And also, well, in this case, I'm adding the sausage. Some people might add some shredded chicken into the mix instead of the sausage. Some people might even add maybe some steak, this kind of very thin cut of beef. They would grill it and then just like cut it into small pieces, throw it in here. So you can play with it. Usually I think the base of this a la Mexicana is the tomato, onion, maybe garlic and jalapeno or some kind of chili. In this case, you might have seen it in other videos as well. It's very common. And some people add the zucchinis and keep that just as maybe as a vegetarian option or even vegan option. You can also, instead of the chicken stock, for example, use some vegetable stock and keep it quite vegan, vegetarian friendly. In this case, I added the nakit, the sausages, or the weenies as people might call them as well. Nakit is the Finnish term. Because it's very simple, it's also very, well, kind of like cheap. It's not as expensive as meat. It's also something that, well, you will get some kind of meat in there. And it's something that my family used to do like this. I remember my cousin used to love this. And it's a very simple dish, very quick. I think the longest time it took, it was like cutting everything and preparing everything beforehand. But once you have done that, it's very quick. Having it on the fire is maybe 10-15 minutes. Like overall, very quick, very nice as well, because this is a whole meal. You can serve it also on top of maybe some rice because you have the liquid. It's very nice. I hope you like it. You try it at home. Press like, subscribe, activate the bell, all those kind of things. And see you in the next one.